Penguin Island by Anatole, France. Book 8, Future Times. Book 8, The Endless History, and Section 1. The Endless History.
Alca is becoming Americanized.
Monsieur Danisset. And he overthrew those cities, and all the plain, and all the inhabitants of the cities, and that which grew upon the ground. Genesis 19:25. Poverty has ever been familiar to Greece, but virtue has been acquired, having been accomplished by wisdom and firm laws. Herodotus, Histories 7:102.
You have not seen angels, then?
Liber Terribilis. Ukfut fus fut höv tus juf bumb b up stufef tis jitfu kvut funkfus fust bukst fin budst kusp dumben fusp jitk jitbun jik fusfun buksbod fut futu tippen jitfube fut bupunkve hodged jobo dist hutte Budget kupt juf tisjit dift tiftev kust für kubs muffen. Pis føyve kusf. Tid fub diffefedge sij hif bermbuk judgno. Bovenpajax Vasirjev. We are now beginning to study a chemistry which will deal with effects produced by bodies containing a quantity of concentrated energy, the like of which we have not yet had at our disposal. Sir William Ramsay. Section 1. The houses were never high enough to satisfy them. They kept on making them still higher and built them of 30 or 40 stories. With offices, shops, banks, societies one above another, they dug cellars and tunnels ever deeper downwards. 15 millions of men laboured in a giant town by the light of beacons which shed forth their glare both day and night. No light of heaven pierced through the smoke of the factories with which the town was girt. But sometimes the red disk of a rayless sun might be seen riding in the black firmament, through which iron bridges ploughed their way, and from which there descended a continual shower of soot and cinders. It was the most industrial of all the cities in the world, and the richest. Its organization seemed perfect. None of the ancient aristocratic or democratic forms remained. Everything was subordinated to the interests of the trusts. This environment gave rise to what anthropologists called the multimillionaire type. The men of this type were at once energetic and frail, capable of great activity in forming mental combinations and of prolonged labour in offices, but men whose nervous irritability suffered from hereditary troubles which increased as time went on. Like all true aristocrats, like the patricians of republican Rome or the squires of old England, these powerful men affected a great severity in their habits and customs. They were the ascetics of wealth. At the meetings of the trusts an observer would have noticed their smooth and puffy faces, their lantern cheeks, their sunken eyes and wrinkled brows. With bodies more withered, complexions yellower, lips drier, and eyes filled with a more burning fanaticism than those of the old Spanish monks, these multimillionaires gave themselves up with inextinguishable ardour to the austerities of banking and industry. Several, denying themselves all happiness, all pleasure, and all rest, spent their miserable lives in rooms without light or air, furnished only with electrical apparatus, living on eggs and milk and sleeping on camp beds. By doing nothing except pressing nickel buttons with their fingers, these mystics heaped up riches of which they never even saw the signs, and acquired the vain possibility of gratifying desires that they never experienced. The worship of wealth had its martyrs. One of these multimillionaires, the famous Samuel Box, preferred to die rather than surrender the smallest atom of his property. One of his workmen, the victim of an accident while at work, being refused any indemnity by his employer, obtained a verdict in the courts, but repelled by innumerable obstacles of procedure, he fell into the direst poverty. Being thus reduced to despair, he succeeded by dint of cunning and audacity in confronting his employer with a loaded revolver in his hand, and threatened to blow out his brains if he did not give him some assistance. Samuel Box gave nothing, and let himself be killed for the sake of principle. Examples that came from high quarters are followed. Those who possessed some small capital, and they were necessarily the greater number, affected the ideas and habits of the multimillionaires in order that they might be classed among them. All passions which injured the increase or the preservation of wealth were regarded as dishonourable. Neither indolence, nor idleness, nor the taste for disinterested study, nor love of the arts, nor, above all, extravagance was ever forgiven. Pity was condemned as a dangerous weakness. Whilst every inclination to licentiousness excited public reprobation, the violent and brutal satisfaction of an appetite was, on the contrary, excused. Violence, in truth, was regarded as less injurious to morality, since it manifested a form of social energy. The state was firmly based on two great public virtues, respect for the rich and contempt for the poor. Feeble spirits who were still moved by human suffering had no other resource than to take refuge in a hypocrisy which it was impossible to blame, since it contributed to the maintenance of order and the solidity of institutions. Thus, among the rich, all were devoted to their social order, or seemed to be so. All gave good examples, if all did not follow them. Some felt the gravity of their position cruelly, but they endured it either from pride or from duty. Some attempted, in secret and by subterfuge, to escape from it for a moment. One of these, Edward Martin, the president of the Steel Trust, sometimes dressed himself as a poor man, went forth to beg his bread, and allowed himself to be jostled by the passers-by. One day, as he asked alms on a bridge, he engaged in a quarrel with a real beggar, and filled with a fury of envy, he strangled him. As they devoted their whole intelligence to business, they sought no intellectual pleasures. The theatre, which had formerly been very flourishing among them, was now reduced to pantomimes and comic dances. Even the pieces in which women acted were given up. The taste for pretty forms and brilliant toilettes had been lost. The somersets of clowns and the music of negroes were preferred above them, and what roused enthusiasm was the sight of women upon the stage whose necks were blazoned with diamonds, or processions carrying golden bars in triumph. Ladies of wealth were as much compelled as the men to lead a respectable life. According to a tendency common to all civilizations, public feeling set them up as symbols. They were, by their austere magnificence, to represent both the splendour of wealth and its intangible. The old habits of gallantry had been reformed. The fashionable lovers were now secretly replaced by muscular labourers or stray grooms. Nevertheless, scandals were rare. A foreign journey concealed nearly all of them, and the princesses of the Trust remained objects of universal esteem. The rich formed only a small minority, but their collaborators, who composed the entire people, had been completely won over or completely subjugated by them. They formed two classes, the agents of commerce or banking, and workers in the factories. The former contributed an immense amount of work and received large salaries. Some of them succeeded in founding establishments of their own, for in the constant increase of the public wealth, the more intelligent and audacious could hope for anything. Doubtless it would have been possible to find a certain number of discontented and rebellious persons among the immense crowd of engineers and accountants, but this powerful society had imprinted its firm discipline even in the minds of its opponents. The very anarchists were laborious and regular. As for the workmen who toiled in the factories that surrounded the town, their decadence, both physical and moral, was terrible. They were examples of the type of poverty as it is set forth by anthropology. Although the development among them of certain muscles, due to the particular nature of their work, might give a false idea of their strength, they presented sure signs of morbid debility. Of low stature, with small heads and narrow chests, they were further distinguished from the comfortable classes by a multitude of physiological anomalies, and in particular by a common want of symmetry between the head and the limbs. And they were destined to a gradual and continuous degeneration, for the state made soldiers of the more robust among them, and the health of these did not long withstand the brothels and the drink shops that sprang up around their barracks. The proletarians became more and more feeble in mind. The continued weakening of their intellectual faculties was not entirely due to their manner of life. It resulted also from a methodical selection carried out by the employers. The latter, fearing that workmen of too great ability might be inclined to put forward legitimate demands, took care to eliminate them by every possible means, and preferred to engage ignorant and stupid labourers who were incapable of defending their rights, but were yet intelligent enough to perform their toil, which highly perfected machines rendered extremely simple. Thus the proletarians were unable to do anything to improve their lot. With difficulty did they succeed by means of strikes in maintaining the rate of their wages. Even this means began to fail them. The alternations of production inherent in the capitalist system caused such cessations of work that in several branches of industry, as soon as a strike was declared, the accumulation of products allowed the employers to dispense with the strikers. In a word, these miserable employees were plunged in a gloomy apathy that nothing enlightened and nothing exasperated. They were necessary instruments for the social order, and well adapted to their purpose. Upon the whole, this social order seemed the most firmly established that had yet been seen, at least among humankind, for that of bees and ants is incomparably more stable. Nothing could foreshadow the ruin of a system founded on what is strongest in human nature, pride and cupidity. However, keen observers discovered several grounds for uneasiness. The most certain, although the least apparent, were of an economic order, and consisted in the continually increasing amount of overproduction, which entailed long and cruel interruptions of labour, though these were, it is true, utilized by the manufacturers as a means of breaking the power of the workmen by facing them with the prospect of a lockout. A more obvious peril resulted from the physiological state of almost the entire population. "The health of the poor is what it must be," said the experts in hygiene, "but that of the rich leaves much to be desired." It was not difficult to find the causes of this. The supply of oxygen necessary for life was insufficient in the city, and men breathed in an artificial air. The food trusts, by means of the most daring chemical synthesis, produced artificial wines, meat, milk, fruit, and vegetables, and the diet thus imposed gave rise to stomach and brain troubles. The multimillionaires were bald at the age of 18. Some showed from time to time a dangerous weakness of mind. Overstrung and enfeebled, they gave enormous sums to ignorant charlatans, and it was a common thing for some bath attendant or other trumpery, who turned healer or prophet, to make a rapid fortune by the practice of medicine or theology. The number of lunatics increased continually. Suicides multiplied in the world of wealth, and many of them were accompanied by atrocious and extraordinary circumstances, which bore witness to an unheard-of perversion of intelligence and sensibility. Another fatal symptom created a strong impression upon average minds. Terrible accidents, henceforth periodical and regular, entered into people's calculations, and kept mounting higher and higher in statistical tables. Every day machines burst into fragments, houses fell down, trains laden with merchandise fell onto the streets, demolishing entire buildings and crushing hundreds of passers-by. Through the ground, honeycombed with tunnels, 2 or 3 stories of workshops would often crash, engulfing all those who worked in them. End of Book 8, Section 1. Section 2. In the southwestern district of the city, on an eminence which had preserved its ancient name of Fort Saint Michel, there stretched a square where some old trees still spread their exhausted arms above the greensward. Landscape gardeners had constructed a cascade, grottos, a torrent, a lake and an island on its northern slope. From this side one could see the whole town with its streets, its boulevards, its squares, the multitude of its roofs and domes, its air passages and its crowds of men, covered with a veil of silence and seemingly enchanted by the distance. This square was the healthiest place in the capital. Here no smoke obscured the sky, and children were brought here to play. In summer, some employees from the neighbouring offices and laboratories used to resort to it for a moment after their luncheons, but they did not disturb its solitude and peace. It was owing to this custom that one day in June, about midday, a telegraph clerk, Caroline Meslier, came and sat down on a bench at the end of a terrace. In order to refresh her eyes by the sight of a little green, she turned her back to the town. Dark, with brown eyes, robust and placid, Caroline appeared to be from 25 to 28 years of age. Almost immediately, a clerk in the electricity trust, Georges Clair, took his place beside her. Fair, thin, and supple, he had features of a feminine delicacy. He was scarcely older than she, and looked still younger. As they met almost every day in this place, a comradeship had sprung up between them, and they enjoyed chatting together, but their conversation had never been tender, affectionate, or even intimate. Caroline, although it happened to her in the past to repent of her confidence, might perhaps have been less reserved had not George Clair always shown himself extremely restrained in his expressions and behaviour. He always gave a purely intellectual character to the conversation, keeping it within the realm of general ideas, and, moreover, expressing himself on all subjects with the greatest freedom. He spoke frequently of the organization of society and the conditions of labour. "Wealth," said he, "is one of the means of living happily, but people have made it the sole end of existence." And this state of things seemed monstrous to both of them. They returned continually to various scientific subjects with which they were both familiar. On that day they discussed the evolution of chemistry. "From the moment," said Clair, "that radium was seen to be transformed into helium, people ceased to affirm the immutability of simple bodies. In this way all those old laws about simple relations and about the indestructibility of matter were abolished." "However," said she, "chemical laws exist." For being a woman, she had need of belief. He resumed carelessly, "Now that we can procure radium in sufficient quantities, science possesses incomparable means of analysis. Even at present we get glimpses, within what are called simple bodies, of extremely diversified complex ones, and we discover energies in matter which seem to increase even by reason of its tenuity." As they talked, they threw bits of bread to the birds, and some children played around them. Passing from one subject to another, "This hill in the Quaternary epoch," said Clair, "was inhabited by wild horses. Last year, as they were tunnelling for the water mains, they found a layer of the bones of primeval horses." She was anxious to know whether, at that distant epoch, man had yet appeared. He told her that man used to hunt the primeval horse long before he tried to domesticate him. "Man," he added, "was at first a hunter. Then he became a shepherd, a cultivator, a manufacturer, and these diverse civilizations succeeded each other at intervals of time that the mind cannot conceive." He took out his watch. Caroline asked if it was already time to go back to the office. He said it was not, that it was scarcely 12:30. A little girl was making mud pies at the foot of their bench. A little boy of 7 or 8 years was playing in front of them. Whilst his mother was sewing on an adjoining bench, he played all alone at being a runaway horse, and with that power of illusion of which children are capable, he imagined that he was at the same time the horse and those who ran after him, and those who fled in terror before him. He kept struggling with himself and shouting, "Stop him! Hi! Hi! This is an awful horse. He has got the bit between his teeth." Caroline asked the question, "Do you think that men were happy formerly?" Her companion answered, "They suffered less when they were younger. They acted like that little boy. They played. They played at arts, at virtues, at vices, at heroism, at beliefs, at pleasures. They had illusions which entertained them. They made a noise. They amused themselves. But now—" He interrupted himself and looked again at his watch. The child, who was running, struck his foot against the little girl's pail and fell his full length on the gravel. He remained a moment stretched out motionless, then raised himself up on the palms of his hands. His forehead puckered, his mouth opened, and he burst into tears. His mother ran up, but Caroline had lifted him from the ground and was wiping his eyes and mouth with her handkerchief. The child kept on sobbing, and Clair took him in his arms. "Come, don't cry, my little man. I am going to tell you a story. A fisherman once threw his net into the sea and drew out a little sealed copper pot, which he opened with his knife. Smoke came out of it, and as it mounted up to the clouds, the smoke grew thicker and thicker and became a giant, who gave such a terrible yawn that the whole world was blown to dust." Clair stopped himself, gave a dry laugh, and handed the child back to his mother. Then he took out his watch again, and kneeling on the bench with his elbows resting on its back, he gazed at the town. As far as the eye could reach, the multitude of houses stood out in their tiny immensity. Caroline turned her eyes in the same direction. "What splendid weather it is," said she. "The sun's rays change the smoke on the horizon into gold. The worst thing about civilization is that it deprives one of the light of day." He did not answer. His looks remained fixed on a place in the town. After some seconds of silence they saw, about half a mile away, in the richer district on the other side of the river, a sort of tragic fog rearing itself upwards. A moment afterwards an explosion was heard even where they were sitting, and an immense tree of smoke mounted towards the pure sky. Little by little the air was filled with an imperceptible murmur caused by the shouts of thousands of men. Cries burst forth quite close to the square. "What has been blown up? The bewilderment was great, for although accidents were common, such a violent explosion as this one had never been seen, and everybody perceived that something terribly strange had happened. Attempts were made to locate the place of the accident. Districts, streets, different buildings, clubs, theatres and shops were mentioned. Information gradually became more precise, and at last the truth was known. The Steel Trust has just been blown up. Claire put his watch back into his pocket. Caroline looked at him closely, and her eyes filled with astonishment. At last she whispered in his ear: "Did you know it? Were you expecting it? Was it you?" He answered very calmly: "That town ought to be destroyed." She replied in a gentle and thoughtful tone: "I think so too." And both of them returned quietly to their work. End of Book 8, Section 2. Section 3. From that day onward anarchist attempts followed one another every week without interruption. The victims were numerous, and almost all of them belonged to the poorer classes. These crimes roused public resentment. It was among domestic servants, hotel keepers, and the employees of such small shops as the trusts still allowed to exist that indignation burst forth most vehemently. In popular districts women might be heard demanding unusual punishments for the dynamitards. They were called by this old name, although it was hardly appropriate to them, since to these unknown chemists dynamite was an innocent material only fit to destroy ant hills, and they considered it mere child's play to explode nitroglycerin with a cartridge made of fulminate of mercury. Business ceased suddenly, and those who were least rich were the first to feel the effects. They spoke of doing justice themselves to the anarchists. In the meantime, the factory workers remained hostile or indifferent to violent action. They were threatened, as a result of the decline of business, with a likelihood of losing their work, or even a lockout in all the factories. The Federation of Trade Unions proposed a general strike as the most powerful means of influencing the employers and the best aid that could be given to the revolutionists, but all the trades, with the exception of the gliders, refused to cease work. The police made numerous arrests. Troops, summoned from all parts of the National Federation, protected the offices of the trusts, the houses of the multimillionaires, the public halls, the banks, and the big shops. A fortnight passed without a single explosion, and it was concluded that the dynamitards, in all probability but a handful of persons, perhaps even still fewer, had all been killed or captured, or that they were in hiding or had taken flight. Confidence returned. It returned at first among the poorer classes. 200,000 or 300,000 soldiers, who had been lodged in the most closely populated districts, stimulated trade, and people began to cry out, "Hurrah for the army!" The rich, who had not been so quick to take alarm, were reassured more slowly. But at the Stock Exchange a group of bulls spread optimistic rumours and by a powerful effort put a brake upon the fall in prices. Business improved. Newspapers with big circulations supported the movement. With patriotic eloquence they depicted capital as laughing in its impregnable position at the assaults of a few dastardly criminals, and public wealth maintaining its serene ascendancy in spite of the vain threats made against it. They were sincere in their attitude, though at the same time they found it benefited them. Outrages were forgotten or their occurrence denied. On Sundays, at the race meetings, the stands were adorned by women covered with pearls and diamonds. It was observed with joy that the capitalists had not suffered. Cheers were given for the multimillionaires in the saddling rooms. On the following day the Southern Railway Station, the Petroleum Trust, and the huge church built at the expense of Thomas Morcellet were all blown up. 30 houses were in flames, and the beginning of a fire was discovered at the docks. The firemen showed amazing intrepidity and zeal. They managed their tall fire escapes with automatic precision, and climbed as high as 30 stories to rescue the luckless inhabitants from the flames. The soldiers performed their duties with spirit and were given a double ration of coffee, but these fresh casualties started a panic. Millions of people who wanted to take their money with them and leave the town at once crowded the great banking houses. These establishments, after paying out money for 3 days, closed their doors amid mutterings of a riot. A crowd of fugitives, laden with their baggage, besieged the railway stations and took the town by storm. Many who were anxious to lay in a stock of provisions and take refuge in the cellars attacked the grocery stores, although they were guarded by soldiers with fixed bayonets. The public authorities displayed energy. Numerous arrests were made and thousands of warrants issued against suspected persons. During the 3 weeks that followed, no outrage was committed. There was a rumour that bombs had been found in the Opera House, in the cellars of the Town Hall, and beside one of the pillars of the Stock Exchange. But it was soon known that these were boxes of sweets that had been put in those places by practical jokers or lunatics. One of the accused, when questioned by a magistrate, declared that he was the chief author of the explosions, and said that all his accomplices had lost their lives. These confessions were published by the newspapers and helped to reassure public opinion. It was only towards the close of the examination that the magistrates saw they had to deal with a pretender who was in no way connected with any of the crimes. The experts chosen by the courts discovered nothing that enabled them to determine the engine employed in the work of destruction. According to their conjectures, the new explosive emanated from a gas which radium evolves, and it was supposed that electric waves, produced by a special type of oscillator, were propagated through space and thus caused the explosion. But even the ablest chemist could say nothing precise or certain. At last, 2 policemen, who were passing in front of the Hotel Meyer, found on the pavement, close to a ventilator, an egg made of white metal and provided with a capsule at each end. They picked it up carefully, and on the orders of their chief carried it to the municipal laboratory. Scarcely had the experts assembled to examine it than the egg burst and blew up the amphitheatre and the dome. All the experts perished, and with them Collin, the general of the artillery, and the famous Professor Tigre. The capitalist society did not allow itself to be daunted by this fresh disaster. The great banks reopened their doors, declaring that they would meet demands partly in bullion and partly in paper money guaranteed by the state. The Stock Exchange and the Trade Exchange, in spite of the complete cessation of business, decided not to suspend their sittings. In the meantime, the magisterial investigation into the case of those who had been first accused had come to an end. Perhaps the evidence brought against them might have appeared insufficient under other circumstances, but the zeal both of the magistrates and the public made up for this insufficiency. On the eve of the day fixed for the trial, the courts of justice were blown up, and 800 people were killed, the greater number of them being judges and lawyers. A furious crowd broke into the prison and lynched the prisoners. The troops sent to restore order were received with showers of stones and revolver shots, several soldiers being dragged from their horses and trampled underfoot. The soldiers fired on the mob and many persons were killed. At last the public authorities succeeded in establishing tranquillity. Next day the bank was blown up. From that time onwards unheard of things took place. The factory workers who had refused to strike rushed in crowds into the town and set fire to the houses. Entire regiments, led by their officers, joined the workmen, went with them through the town singing revolutionary hymns, and took barrels of petroleum from the docks with which to feed the fires. Explosions were continual. One morning a monstrous tree of smoke, like the ghost of a huge palm tree half a mile in height, rose above the giant telegraph hall, which suddenly fell into a complete ruin. Whilst half the town was in flames, the other half pursued its accustomed life. In the mornings, milk pails could be heard jingling in the dairy carts. In a deserted avenue some old navvy might be seen seated against a wall, slowly eating hunks of bread with perhaps a little meat. Almost all the presidents of the trusts remained at their posts. Some of them performed their duty with heroic simplicity. Raphael Box, the son of a martyred multimillionaire, was blown up as he was presiding at the general meeting of the Sugar Trust. He was given a magnificent funeral, and the procession on its way to the cemetery had to climb 6 times over piles of ruin or cross upon planks over the uprooted roads. The ordinary helpers of the rich, the clerks, employees, brokers, and agents, preserved an unshaken fidelity. The surviving clerks of the bank that had been blown up made their way along the ruined streets through the midst of smoking houses to hand in their bills of exchange, and several were swallowed up in the flames while endeavouring to present their receipts. Nevertheless, any illusion concerning the state of affairs was impossible. The enemy was master of the town. Instead of silence, the noise of explosions was now continuous, and produced an insurmountable feeling of horror. The lighting apparatus having been destroyed, the city was plunged in darkness all through the night, and appalling crimes were committed. The populous districts alone, having suffered the least, still preserved measures of protection. They were paraded by patrols of volunteers who shot the robbers, and at every street corner one stumbled over a body lying in a pool of blood, the hands bound behind the back, a handkerchief over the face, and a placard pinned upon the breast. It became impossible to clear away the ruins or to bury the dead. Soon the stench from the corpses became intolerable. Epidemics raged and caused innumerable deaths, while they also rendered the survivors feeble and listless. Famine carried off almost all who were left. 101 days after the first outrage, whilst 6 army corps with field artillery and siege artillery were marching at night into the poorest quarter of the city, Caroline and Claire, holding each other's hands, were watching from the roof of a lofty house, the only one still left standing, but now surrounded by smoke and flame. Joyous songs ascended from the street, where the crowd was dancing in delirium. "Tomorrow it will be ended," said the man, "and it will be better." The young woman, her hair loosened and her face shining with the reflection of the flames, gazed with a pious joy at the circle of fire that was growing closer around them. "It will be better," said she also, and throwing herself into the destroyer's arms, she pressed a passionate kiss upon his lips. End of Book 8, Section 3. Section 4. The other towns of the Federation also suffered from disturbances and outbreaks, and then order was restored. Reforms were introduced into institutions, and great changes took place in habits and customs. But the country never recovered the loss of its capital, and never regained its former prosperity. Commerce and industry dwindled away, and civilization abandoned those countries which for so long it had preferred to all others. They became insalubrious and sterile. The territory that had supported so many millions of men became nothing more than a desert. On the hill of Fort Saint Michel, wild horses cropped the coarse grass. Days flowed by like water from the fountains, and the centuries passed like drops falling from the ends of stalactites. Hunters came to chase the bears upon the hills that covered the forgotten city. Shepherds led their flocks upon them. Labourers turned up the soil with their ploughs. Gardeners cultivated their lettuces and grafted their pear trees. They were not rich, and they had no arts. The walls of their cabins were covered with old vines and roses. A goatskin clothed their tanned limbs, while their wives dressed themselves with the wool that they themselves had spun. The goatherds moulded little figures of men and animals out of clay, or sang songs about the young girl who follows her lover through the woods or among the browsing goats, while the pine trees whisper together and the water utters its murmuring sound. The master of the house grew angry with the beetles who devoured his figs. He planned snares to protect his fowls from the velvet-tailed fox, and he poured out wine for his neighbours, saying, "Drink, the flies have not spoilt my vintage. The vines were dry before they came." Then in the course of ages the wealth of the villages and the corn that filled the fields were pillaged by barbarian invaders. The country changed its masters several times. The conquerors built castles upon the hills, cultivation increased, mills, forges, tanneries, and looms were established. Roads were opened through the woods and over the marshes. The river was covered with boats. The hamlets became large villages, and joining together formed a town, which protected itself by deep trenches and lofty walls. Later becoming the capital of a great state, it found itself straitened within its now useless ramparts, and it converted them into grass-covered walks. It grew very rich and large beyond measure. The houses were never high enough to satisfy the people. They kept on making them still higher, and built them of 30 or 40 stories, with offices, shops, banks, societies, one above another. They dug cellars and tunnels ever deeper downwards. 15 millions of men laboured in the giant town. End of Book 8, Section 4, and the end of Penguin Island.